my equipment is all up and operating here. I've given Daniel permission to hit me up by phone if something goes haywire. We had that happen in our group meeting a couple weeks ago. It was actually my equipment that froze and threw the meeting off by 10 minutes because it froze my stuff and they couldn't get it off. But anyway, I'm grateful to be here. I'm Robert Fryan. I'm an alcoholic. And appreciate you guys having me here. And this is the first time I've done a Zoom talk. So it's a little awkward, not being out at a podium or physically somewhere. I've got an orange cat that's making some noise in the background. If that gets too meddling, we'll try to shut that down. And I've got some children that may run through. It's just one of those things. You're grateful to have a place to meet and even a virtual online meeting like this. But it makes you grateful for being able to leave the house a little bit too, and grateful for what your spouse or significant other may be able to do with your children or family while you're gone. Because being at home lends its own set of problems in terms of trying to focus on the meeting and be a service to others. But again, grateful to be here, grateful to be asked. My sobriety date is April 2nd, 1997. And my home group is the Willow Springs group in Wake County. If you don't know where that is, it's Fuquay Varina, southern Wake County, just south of Raleigh by about 10 miles or so. We used to be in the little town or village of Willow Springs, and we had to leave the church we were in. We moved into downtown Fuquay. So we meet on Thursday and Sunday night. We have the speaker meeting at 8 o'clock on Thursdays. And at 7 o'clock on Sunday, we have the beginners meeting / step study meeting. Making these talks is a little bit awkward. I would like to give Daniel a hard time. I do want to point out, I did get sober before Daniel did, maybe at least a year before he did. So I say things in jest, but it's hard to get, gauge things. If I say anything, I don't mean it to be cruel. It's giving people a hard time. But no, I've known Daniel a long time. I've known Earl and Kelly and Steve and probably a bunch of others of you. I'm using my iPhone, so I can only see 3 or 4 of you at once. I know there are a bunch of people in this meeting that I can't see. So if I'm ignoring those that I can't see, just bear with me. So, it is nice that we can sort of gather like this. Anytime I've been asked to change, whether it was from drunk to sober or different periods in my sobriety, it's always been difficult for me. I don't know whether it's true for alcoholics or just people in general as a whole in terms of trying to, to be open to change. But I was one that resisted heavily doing anything with Zoom with our group. I thought it was overblown. Everything was wild. And people were hysterical, and then Wake County really kind of shut us down about a month or so ago. We really couldn't meet at all. The church was still allowing us to meet, but even though Zoom has its own problems, it's something we can be grateful for, that we're still able to get together even in this environment. Because if we didn't have this, it would be, I think, a lot more difficult for folks. I know for me, the one thing I miss is trying to catch newcomers. I mean, I don't think we've had a newcomer really at our group in a month. I mean, that I know of, but we're trying to get the word out there about our Zoom stuff, but I'm not sure it's accessible to people, particularly people who are not already at least connected to a group or connected to one of us to sponsorship. And I think that's unfortunate. Maybe we'll find a way to work through that, or maybe things will open up again. But I do miss the aspect of trying to capture the new guy. It's been almost, it's been 23 years now since I got sober. I just picked up a chip, but I was a new guy who wanted to slip into the meeting. Wanted help, but I didn't want help. And so I would slide into the A meeting and I would sit in the back. I would try to go get a huge cup of coffee and fill it with sugar and then slip back in the back row. And then it's like, as soon as I got over to the coffee pot, I would turn around and there'd be like 5 A members behind me with meeting pamphlets in their hands and meeting schedules in their hands. And they obviously were trying to capture me and talk to me about sponsorship and talk to me about getting sober. And I was baffled that they thought I was a newcomer. I mean, Daniel described my demeanor earlier when he introduced me. I did have very long hair. It actually got much longer as I stayed sober, in fact. But I couldn't figure out how they knew I was a new guy. I thought, man, there's 30, 40 people in the meeting. Why are they always picking on me? Because part of me wanted to help. Part of me wanted to stay in that isolation that I was at least comfortable with to some extent. And I'm so grateful for those early members. And the reason that, they knew I was new, if you're just like this group, I mean, at least we're meeting in person at Willow Springs, we know who the new people are. Most of us are there all the time for the most part. And somebody new wanders in, they're either a guest or a newcomer. We jump right on them and try to carry the message, which is what that group did for me. And they really did for me. You know, we talk about this in the literature. God and AA doing for us, we can't do it for ourselves. I'm grateful that they reached out to me. I didn't know what sponsorship was. I didn't know what step work was. I was a guy who drank himself out of college, had drank away all my friends, had nearly driven my family away. They were letting me stay at their house, having flunked out of college if I stayed sober. And then that was not entirely true. As I came to AA, I was still continuing to drink a little bit on the side. But I was very scared, very confused, and just grateful that the AA members reached out to me. In fact, I asked Daniel before the meeting when this group started, because my sponsor, Steve Mitchell, and a number of other AA members drugged me from Wilson, where I ended up crash landing with my drinking, and where I got sober. They drugged me over to Southern Pines when I think Tom and whoever else, in fact, started that group. There may have been some others that I don't know who started that group, but they would drive me over there. So I was in meetings with some of you guys, you know, Waylon and Earl and Daniel, maybe later in 97 or 98, whenever you got sober, very early on. And that's the kind of stuff that taught me you could have a little bit of fun and sobriety, because I was so isolated, so scared as a newcomer. And we would get in the car, and my sponsor would play this old, really old country music, like really old stuff, you know, and it was weird, but we'd talk and he let me smoke in his car, which I thought was kind of awesome. And we'd drive. It felt like it took forever to get from Wilson to Southern Pines. I think it is it's a decent drive. You got to drive an hour to where I live in Harnett County by Fuquay, and then it's about another hour from here over on Highway 27. But I'm grateful for that time. I'm grateful for the men and women who were part of that, and took me out and showed me the bigger world of AA. Again, that there could be a life beyond drinking. It seems crazy to think that drinking was all I had left, but I can tell you there was a time when I felt that, and it certainly was not true. But again, I credit the early members for those folks who helped me and brought me out of that isolation. My good friend Paige, I always tell the story. In fact, I got to tell it in front of Paige recently and give him credit for it. But in 97, I was coming to that group in late 96, early 97. I didn't get sober till April 2nd of 97, but they were giving me, you know, group lists and pamphlets and stuff like that in the months before April of 97. And there really weren't there were cell phones. I think Jerry Weaver, Broken Feather had one, but they were kind of crappy, you know. They weren't like they are now. And people would still give you their home number for the most part. And I remember Paige gave me a pamphlet with his home number written on it and his work number on it. And it just was one of those first little things that sort of struck you as powerful in AA, was that a guy would give me his work number as some crazy, weird newcomer, you know, walking into this group, that a guy cared enough to give me his work number. Now, I didn't call it. I don't know what kind of conversation that would have been like if I called Paige's work and said, I'm a new guy, I feel like drinking, I'd like to talk to Paige. I think the people at his work did know Paige was a very good AA member at that time. And they probably knew he was in AA, but I don't know what that conversation would have been like. But those are the kind of members, probably members like your group, my group, that are willing to go that, you know, to any length to carry the message, and grateful that they shook me out of that. So let me talk a little bit about my drinking here. You know, I'm a guy who got sober young. I didn't intend to get sober young. I intended to drink as long as I possibly could, but my drinking career lasted only about 5 years total. And it's just my story. I almost used to be ashamed of that, like I had, like I wasn't qualified or something. And let me tell you, when I was getting sober, I used it as an excuse why I didn't need to quit drinking. And I will at least caveat this by saying I was involved in a lot of other substances, but this is AA, and I couldn't find my remarks to my alcoholism, and I respect AA's singleness of purpose, but certainly dabbled heavily in anything I could get that would alter my mood or whatever, or my consciousness. And so did a lot of that stuff too. But anyway, my drinking career was much shorter than I intended. Again, I always look, it's interesting when you're making a talk, and I think sometimes around your anniversary, your sobriety anniversary, which I just had one on April 2nd, you begin to sort of think back. I mean, how different life was 23 years ago. I was living at mom and dad's house again, flunked out of college, had no skills, no money, literally no property of my own. I mean, things looked bleak, but in hindsight, it was really the beginning of coming alive. To me, it seemed like life was over. I was 19 years old when I got sober. I'd never taken a legal drink of alcohol. It seemed like that things were really bad, and they were really bad. I mean, I caused a lot of chaos and problems and destruction in my own life, just like we all do with our drinking, and that was bad. But the sense was the fact that I had blown it all up ended up being a good thing. That's what we learn in AA, is that sometimes the bad things we do become good. Now, they don't feel very good when we're doing them or when we're stuck in them or whatever problems might be self-imposed or not on us. But sometimes we've learned in Alcoholics Anonymous that we can turn that for good. And so I've been able to share that experience with others and help them. And my experience of getting sober at 19, I've been able to share that with other young members that come in. Daniel's right. I used to have a lot longer hair. I used to be a lot younger than I am now. It's amazing how everybody's gotten a lot older over the years. But I'm a guy who started out drinking. As best I can recall, I broke into my parents' liquor stash. I got good, hardworking, principled parents who've always shown up to work and done the right thing because it's the right thing to do. They taught me right from wrong, honesty. They had me, they stayed on me to be a good student. I went all the way through the Presbyterian Church. Remember, I was confirmed in the church. They taught me principles, but for some reason, it never took on me. I always resisted any kind of authority. I hated going to church. I hated every time I went. It seemed like to me. It seemed like it was all about me. It was forced on me. I talked to my brother, who I think is actually in this meeting tonight. He's an AA member as well. But I talked to him about that, and his experience was like totally different. I was like, man, they were always making us go to church, man. Every time I turned around to church, I hated it. He's like, man, I don't really remember it that way. So it's funny how your perception can be different. So I'm not sure if it was completely true or not about some of the stuff. I think my parents raised me as well as they could and grateful for what they did. But I was a guy who was just always uncomfortable, very self-centered. In hindsight, extremely self-centered. I thought that them making me go to church was about punishing me, is what it felt like. It wasn't, but it's just what I thought. And my wife, who's wise, she's a regular Earth person, not an AA member, non-alcoholic, but I guess that didn't really mean anything, but that's who she is. And we've been married a long time, and I was complaining, this is several years ago, about I will occasionally lament about how I was forced to go to church so much as a kid, how much I hated it. I'll still bring that out and shop it around a little bit, whoever wants to hear it. And I was doing that one day in the car with my wife. She said, your parents really go to church like you go to AA. And I was like, that's not right. I don't know what you're talking about. You're crazy. And I thought about it for a minute, and I was like, you know what? They were really just trying to be good church members. In fact, they were good church members. They went to church on Sunday. They went to Sunday school. They had me participating in youth group activities and things like that. And what they were doing were being good church members and participating actively in church. Nothing wrong with that. I thought it was all about me. They're trying to raise me right, make me, be honest and not have sex before marriage and not drink. And that's how I viewed it all, was through my self-centeredness. And it's funny how wisdom will come to you from other people like that. It's often how I've gained that. And so it had very little to do with me. It had a lot more with my parents being good members of that church. So your perspective can change. But when I started drinking out of my parents' liquor cabinet, as I recall, we were riding bikes around, and I discovered that my parents had this really untapped stash of liquor. My parents never drank at home. They never drank liquor ever that I could hardly tell. My father would drink wine sometimes, my mother wine at parties or when they're out. But people would give them liquor for like the holidays or gifts or whatever. They just amassed this stash of it in a sort of a storage room under their stairs. And they never looked at it. They had no idea what was there. So my friends and I just started experimenting. So we're grabbing bottles, and we don't know what this stuff is sometimes. And we're pouring half our Pepsi cans out and pouring it in there. We're riding around the neighborhood on bikes. We'd go find a place to smoke cigarettes and drink liquor. And, nobody ever got in trouble. I don't think any of us ever drank, quite enough really to get sloppy drunk or to get found out that we were doing it. We were just in our early teens, I suppose. But I always liked it. I liked the way it made me feel. Made me feel like I fit in. It took away. I was a kid who, again, despite the attempts of my parents to bring me up, I was full of fear. I mean, if I can remember one thing about my childhood, I had no reason to be afraid, but was constantly afraid. Constantly felt like everyone else had been given the directions, and I was not given the directions. I don't think my life turned out that way. I think I did okay in school. I was able to be social with people, but it always felt so awkward from my internal sort of view. And I always felt like I was coming from behind and afraid and all that kind of stuff. And So when I started drinking the liquor with my friends, I found a way to take that away, at least for a little while. And again, it wasn't something I began to do every day, but it dawned on me that if I could, ride around on a Friday or Saturday with my buddies and drink, whatever we poured into our can that day, that I could do that. I could get in that stash on my own on Tuesday or Wednesday night or whenever it was and get that feeling. And again, I don't know that makes me an alcoholic, but as I look back, I think that's a clue to my alcoholism. That from the really early on, I liked drinking so much, I was willing to sit down and drink by myself at night and get into that stuff. And so never set out to cause the destruction of my life and the life of other people that ultimately happened. But that's what happened. So my drinking set off from there. I'd say my drinking was normal for a few years, at least into the middle part of high school. It was normal. I mean, I could drink on the weekends. We'd have parties on the weekends. I grew up in Wilson, North Carolina, which is a small town. I don't know whether it's about the size of Southern Pines. Maybe it is. I don't know. But we had friends who, if their parents were going to be gone, there was kind of a rotating crew of us that would drink and throw a party at someone's house. And so I started getting involved in those parties on the weekends. We drink beer mostly and that kind of stuff and smoke cigarettes and dabble in some other things, but none of it ever really got out of hand. But I don't know when the line was crossed for me. I don't think it matters much, but sometime between 10th and 12th grade of high school, I started drinking every day. And I went from a guy who had fun with my drinking and would do it socially with my friends to where that's all I wanted to do. I started doing it before school, during school, and after school. And I spent most nights doing that. And I was able to kind of hold it together pretty good in the beginning. I fancied myself a good student. And I think in high school, for at least some extent, I was a good student. I like to participate in sports. I'm not any kind of athlete or anything, but what happened was I look back at that time, drinking began to erode that stuff. And so we'd always play pickup basketball with my friends. Well, instead of doing that, I'm going home and drinking. Or I'm drunk and I'll try and go play basketball while I'm drunk, and it's not any fun. And everybody gets mad at me because I'm sloppy drunk trying to play basketball. And so that kind of stuff happened for me. And by the time I got out of high school, I think I was a full-blown alcoholic. I don't think I would have admitted that, but I was. My family's had a history, I think, a history of depression, and I think a bit of a history of alcoholism, I think. But I think what had happened for me by the time I got out of high school was that my drinking had changed. And instead of drinking being something I did for free and for fun and something that relieved the anxiety for me, relieved the fear, a lot of that stuff was coming back. And what was happening was if I was not drunk, I was even more afraid and more uncertain, and felt like I couldn't make choices without being drunk. And I bought into that incorrect belief that I was more creative and intellectual and all this when I was drinking. There was no evidence to support that at all, but I was convinced that I would get drunk and I would just be the man and have all these great ideas. And so that I had really, really wrapped up my drinking by the time I got out of high school. But the fear and stuff had come back for me. I was having some problems in relationships, and there's some anger and some stuff going on. And I got referred to a psychiatrist who I started seeing my senior year of high school. And so I'm telling this guy, as a man, all these symptoms of having fear, sleeplessness, anxiety, anger, just feeling delusional sometimes. And of course, I'm not telling about how much I'm drinking or all the drugs I'm using. So if you take all the symptoms I'm describing to the guy and they never tested me for anything, or even really, that I recall even asked me about my drinking. If they did, I certainly lied about it, but I really don't remember ever them really engaging me about my drinking or anything like that. And so they I'm no telling what they diagnosed me with. I mean, the way I was living by senior in high school, I mean, it was wild. We'd go stay up several nights in a row, drunk, and things get weird when you start living like that, and you get depressed and crazy and angry. And so they first started treating me for depression and anxiety, and they just threw pills at me, and it was fine by me. I was used to taking pills, and I was good at that. And so I took the antidepressants, and I took the Xanax and the Klonopin, and it really just sort of continued the party for me. And I think as I look back, I was looking for a change and looking for a solution, but certainly not ready to give up drinking, and would not have probably been willing to admit that my drinking might have been the reason for some of that craziness in my life at that time. Well, a year later, there was no doubt about it. I left high school, got into college at Appalachian State University, and my drinking absolutely blew wide open. I think there's one other person I heard make a talk one time who had this experience, but I managed to drink so much my first semester of college that I didn't even finish the first semester of college. And that's kind of hard to do. You know, you can, I've known a lot of really serious alcoholic drinkers. I mean, really, legit alcoholics who get drunk their first semester and they're put on academic probation the spring semester, and then they really blow it out and they flunk out the next semester. But I literally was getting so much to drink and just living my life in such a way that I couldn't stand it. And so I dropped out before the end of the first semester my freshman year, which is not a real great start. And life had obviously between high school and college had really, my drinking had even reached new heights. It was all the time. I was a guy that if it weren't for my parents putting me up, I would have been homeless. I mean, I couldn't work. I would not have been self-supporting. I didn't go to class. I mean, I sort of left Wilson and went to a college in the mountains called Appalachian State in Boone. And I thought by going that far away to the west in Boone that I could recreate my life, that something would be different. I'd feel better again. I could drink normally again. Things would settle down. Some of that anger I've been having and problems sleeping would go away if I moved to a new town. It really sounded like a good idea. But again, I showed up when I got there, and instead of there being any changes being made, I just ramped up my drinking. And so I'll just give you an example of sort of what the reason I didn't last an entire semester of college. But they were doing like placement testing, I guess, at that time. This is 1996. They still used to call in and register for your classes on like a touch tone phone. And I mean, it was just a bit of a different. It's hard to imagine that now, but they had these like writing tests and things like that. And again, I was under the belief that if I got really good and loaded and drunk, that I would be really creative. And I knew there was a writing test coming up. So we're at a friend of mine's apartment just off campus where we drank all the time. And I thought, I know this test is coming up. I don't know when it was. I think it was mid-afternoon, 2:00. So I started drinking, right around lunchtime, and I'm just trying to get my mind right, which is what I would do sometimes, and get that right level of drunk where I just knew I was going to wow everybody with what I had to say or do. And so, which was maybe a good idea, but when I left that guy's apartment, I was so drunk I couldn't find the right building for the test. Now, I hadn't been in Appalachian very long, to my credit, I suppose, but I thought I knew where I was supposed to go. And maybe have been sober, I would have found it, but I had no chance. I mean, I was wandering drunk all over that campus, and eventually got sort of frantic about it all. And I think someone eventually directed me where I was supposed to go, and I stumbled in late, reeking of whiskey, and they gave me whatever the materials were, and then I sit down, I thought, man, I get on late, I'm just wait till they get a load of this writing, or that was just how I started. And so you can suspect that was probably not very good writing, and probably didn't help my academics at all to start that way. But that's literally how I approached college. Instead of it being a change for the good, it ended up being just more freedom to drink. And I was just, even at a young age, if there's anyone young in the meeting, I mean, I'm not a doctor. I can't diagnose anyone else. But you could be an alcoholic full blown at 18. I think I was. And anyway, I left there with the clothes on my back before the end of the semester, blaming immediately that it was the dorm I lived in and the college environment that was making me drink so much, and the reason I was failing out. Again, I had just left Wilson with the same blame kind of, scheme that it was Wilson and the girl I was dating and those friends. And I was just delusional. I couldn't see the true from the false. There was no doubt it wasn't the fault of that dorm or that college, but it was easy to blame that. And I think some people do get a little wild when they go to college, but I was way beyond any of that kind of stuff. And so when I landed back at Mom and Dad's house, they strongly suggested I go into a treatment center, and I did. I didn't think I needed to go. Again, I thought I was too young to be an alcoholic. I thought I just needed to hang out the rest of that semester, clear my head, and I could go back in the spring semester. I don't know what I thought was going to be different, but I just kept thinking something was going to be different, and it wasn't. But grateful for that treatment center. I got dried out in there. I met my first sober alcoholics in there. There was a guy named Dennis who was operating in the Raleigh area. I think he was an A member at that time, and he was one of the counselors. He was working professionally too, but he did the intake on me. Of course, I'm lying to him about how much I'm drinking, all that stuff, And he pushed his papers aside and spent a few minutes telling me a little bit about his drinking. I don't think he had to do that. I mean, I suppose that's a good professional practice, but it's certainly what we do in AA. And he was an AA member at that time. And he was the first alcoholic I ever identified with as a sober alcoholic. You know, we had that kind of crying over the bottle with my friends. I had some friends, I think they were alcoholics at that time too, but nobody who had ever really found a way out was happy about it. And so what he told me was that he had lost an eye in his drinking and had taken it way further than I had, way longer than I had in years and everything else. And he said, he basically, his take was, if you do what we're asking you to do here, you can have my life. And I remember him saying this, and I don't remember much from this period of time. It was very foggy and very confused, but he said, if I could give you a videotape of my life, it'd be just like yours is right now when I was drinking. And I guarantee if you'll do the stuff we're asking you to do, if you go to A and do what they ask you to do, you can have the life that I'm sitting here with today. And it just gave me so much hope. It was the first sober alcoholic that I ever identified with. And so it gave me hope. I found some people that I wasn't just crazy. I didn't have bad luck. I wasn't living in the wrong places. I found out that I was an alcoholic. And so I will mention this, just, my sponsors are real stickler for the fifth tradition, and so am I. But I do want to just offer this because I think it's important for my drinking that I think some of us try this sometimes. But I got dried out off of drugs in December of 96 in that treatment center. And I was young, and I thought, well, again, I'm looking for something to blame. But here I am, 19 years old. I got off that other stuff. I can drink successfully now. It's just that. And I think this is a good valid point. I've worked with alcoholics who've had this kind of issue, and there may be somebody sitting out there right now who's thinking the same thing, and I'll just share my experience on it. But I thought if I just drank only, that I would be okay, and that I could do that successfully if I left the other stuff alone. Well, you can suspect what happened. So I got out of that treatment center, and my drinking was slow at first. I could drink a six-pack every week, every 2 weeks. It wasn't all that bad. But by the time March rolled around, this would be March of 97, my drinking had ramped way up. I was looking for an excuse to go out and drink. Some of my buddies who I drank with were failing out of college at the spring semester, when you really should fail out of college with drinking. They were coming back to Wilson. We were getting together and drinking, and I left this girl's house at the east side of Wilson and went to Greenville. At that time, if we were going to drive anywhere, we'd have a few beers. That's just how we did it. It's not right, but we always drank and drove. It was never a big deal. And we drank on the way to Greenville. I don't know what we did at Greenville. We drove back late at night. I'm leaving her house. And as I'm leaving her house, I'm out on this country road. She lived out in the country. And somehow I managed to drive my old beat-up drunk truck off the road on the right. It spun around, went across the road, facing the opposite direction, and flipped over. I think it just flipped over once onto its roof. And I'm laying there. I don't hardly know what happened. I was not wearing a seatbelt. I remember being pulled from the wheel and hitting the passenger side door. This was like a 1986 Ford F-250 truck. It had one of those old bench seats. It did not have a center console or bucket seats or anything like you see now. It was a straight across kind of thing. And you could slide straight across and hit the passenger side door. I did, and I remember flipping over. And, a lot of people die in those kind of rollover accidents. They kill other people in rollover accidents. And I thought, here it is. I got to get out of here. As it turns out, it's completely unharmed. I'm laying on the roof, looking up at the floor of the car. The CD player somehow miraculously is still spinning the Grateful Dead CD I had on, but the engine had stopped, and it was quiet. The CD was playing, and the light was blinking like a blinker was blinking. And my first thought was, I got to get out of here. I've been drinking, and so I climb out, and I figured I'd try and get away. I'd try to walk to town is what I was going to do. And as luck would have it, I'd turn that thing over right in someone's front yard. It was a house out in the country, and they, as good people should, they called the police. I didn't think they should have called the police, but when someone flips a car in your front yard, you call the police and the ambulance. That's the right thing to do. Again, I didn't think it was them, but anyway, someone called my parents. We didn't have cell phones on how they figured that out, but anyway, my parents showed up. The ambulance showed up, checked me out. I was totally fine. Didn't even have a scratch on me. As I recall, again, this is a foggy period of my time, and I was drunk this night. But there was an an older, seasoned highway patrolman was the one who responded. And he did not give me a DWI, let me go home to my parents that night. Now, I did not deserve that break, I can assure you. I had other breaks similar to that before that I did not deserve. Now, my ego and my self-centeredness, I think I deserve a pass, right? The rules might be fine, for you guys, but they're not fine for me. I'm the guy who gets a pass on that. I played right into that. But again, I'm grateful for that, but I should have got DWI that night. But what had been happening was I'd gone to AA meetings, and again, I had been going to AA a little bit and gotten out of that treatment center. But that car accident ended up being something bad that came to good. And the good that came out of that car accident was that I went, there was an AA meeting the next night. This was a Friday night. I had the car accident. The principals group of Wilson at that time had a Saturday night speaker meeting. Some of you guys spoke there over the years. And the fact is, it was Wallace Bryant that was speaking that night. And so I went to that meeting that night with the idea that I had been sitting in some meetings. I liked it. I could identify. It felt good. But I wasn't working any steps. I didn't have a sponsor, didn't have a home group. And I just had a moment of clarity, which I rarely had at that time, that if I didn't get to work in AA, that I would end up rolled over the next time in that truck, or would get the DWI, or whatever else might happen. I had very few moments of clarity. And I'm grateful there were some AA members that came into that treatment center. And again, a very foggy time for me, but I remember them saying, I worked the steps and I didn't want to drink anymore. And I remember some of them saying that they had been sober, had problems in their life, and they worked the steps again and it got better. And that's all I remember. I thought, maybe I need to work the steps. And I didn't know what the steps were. But again, I'd heard about sponsorship, and I've been watching a couple of those older members who would sit at the front table. I'm hiding in the back row. And Steve, I've been watching him. He was happy about his sobriety. He seemed to be walking the walk, so to speak. And I caught him before the speaker meeting, told him I'd been in a wreck. I really wanted to sponsor. And he said, well, let's talk about it after the meeting. And that's what he still does today. That's what I do with new guys. I make them meet with me to talk about what sponsorship is. But I had no idea what sponsorship was at the time. I didn't know what that meant. But I thought I needed one, so people said. And so we rode around downtown Wilson in his car, and he talked to me about working the steps and being current with him. And I just said yes to anything he wanted. I didn't have any better ideas. I was out of ideas then. I'd moved towns, been to doctors, been to treatment. And I thought, well, might as well give AA a try. And I'm very grateful for that, because I can look back to that decision to get a sponsor, and the rest of my life has taken off from there. Now, it doesn't mean I don't have problems and things haven't gone weird at times, and I've certainly have made mistakes in my sobriety, but I can look back to getting a sponsor as the one good decision I made in early sobriety. And so he told me that we would begin working the steps. Again, like I said, I didn't know what the steps were. He told me, which I know is true now, that the big book was written by some early AA members who found a formula, which they called the steps, that they would do together, and they would meet together regularly. And they figured out if they did that, it would stay sober. And that seemed like a good idea to me. I was out of ideas. And he said, we're going to do what they did. I said, all right, sounds good to me. And so Steve was single at that time. I was single and had no social life, was doing some manual labor work at that time on a plant nursery, loading plants and stuff like that. And I had a lot of free time too. And we got together at least once a week, maybe twice a week at his house, and he read the big book to me. Again, I thought I was intellectual. I didn't need anybody to read a book to me, but I did. It was very foggy, very slow. And I'm grateful for that. So we went through that thing, and when there was a prayer, we prayed it. When there was an action about writing, we wrote it. And I'm so grateful for that he took me through that process. We got to the fourth step, and my mind is thinking I don't have any defects of character. My sponsor strongly encouraged me to take a second look at that maybe I did have some defects of character. But the excuse I used, I think I've heard somebody else share this one time, was that I was only 19 and I couldn't have developed any defects of character in my 19 years of living. Now, I was chock full of defects of character. I was fundamentally dishonest with everything. I mean, I lied about my drinking. I had to, just like we all do. When alcohol gets to the end of the drinking, you can't tell the truth about your drinking. For the most part, you're going to have to fudge it at least a little bit, unless you just live with other alcoholics maybe. But I lied about my drinking. I lied about a lot of other things. And it was just fundamental to who I was. Now, I never did this, but I think I could have passed the lie detector test. If you had asked me if I was honest, I would have said yes, and I believed it. And that was a delusional kind of belief. There was no reality. It didn't reflect that at all, but I was not really living in reality. I thought I was an honest guy. I thought I was a nice guy, and I wasn't. I was full of dishonesty, but I didn't think I had it. I was full of self-centeredness, full of anger, full of fear, but had lived in those so long, I didn't even know what those were. I didn't really have names for those. I didn't sit around talking about, fear or resentful at a guy. I didn't really know what some of that stuff was, but so grateful I went through there and was able to see some of that stuff, because particularly some of the fear and the self-centeredness had made up a lot of my life. And I think if I had not uncovered some of that stuff, I would have continued to live in it. And I didn't get better all at once. I continued to tell some of the same lies in my first year of sobriety that I've been telling for a while, without even knowing it. In fact, yes, and I'll just share this story because it always seems really, you sit here and we clean up good and it sounds good, but you can really be weird and off and still stay sober. And just because you haven't done everything right doesn't mean you can't stay sober. I think we have to be willing and we have to try. But I don't think there's anywhere in the literature that says we do it right the first time or perfect the first time. We try to stay away from a drink one day at a time. But I had been giving my sobriety date as December of 96, which coincidentally was the time I got off the drugs, and I continued to drink for the next 4 months. But in my state of complete delusion and dishonesty, I've been introducing myself and telling everybody my sobriety date is December 16th of 96. And I did that until about September without any notion that it was wrong or any notion that it was dishonest. I mean, that's how delusional you can be sometimes. And so I'm walking, I ended up being able to go back to college the next year. I got sober and worked the steps with my sponsor, and Appalachian let me back into school. And so I'm walking to class one morning, and it was one that I think we've all had this experience in our sobriety. It hits you that you've been lying about that thing the whole time. Like it was like I didn't know about it. It was delusional. And then boom, I was aware that I've been lying about that the whole time. In my sobriety, it was really around the 1st of April when I last drank. And my first action was to cover it up and not say anything. I'm not going to say anything about that. No reason to bring that up now, that's in the past. And so I spent about 3 days trying to justify why I didn't need to do that and why I didn't need to tell my sponsor that my sobriety was really about 4 months later than it was. And it began to, eat at me. And it was just everything. It consumed me. And I think I would have drank over that if I had not told my sponsor. So I called my sponsor and I said, Steve, this is crazy, but my sobriety date's wrong. And I explained it to him. And of course, if you've been around AA any period of time, we've all done weird things. We've seen about everything. We've worked as newcomers. And it was no big deal to him, but he advised me that when I went back to the principals group in Wilson, I would at least tell them and let them know what had taken place. And I'm grateful for that. And I'm grateful for being able to get honest and confront that. So I think what happened for me and what happens with new people sometimes is that the power of the steps moves slowly in our lives. I didn't suddenly get better. I'm a lot better than I used to be, but it's been very slow progress sometimes, just like that with the honesty. And there were some other things that I lied about that just came out suddenly like that. Like, oh my God, that never really happened. I've been telling it all this time. And I've had a lot of stuff around my self-centeredness where that was too, in terms of, what I think the world owes me and how I ought to be treated and stuff. I've always fancied myself as an exception. And I think by doing step work and staying in the process that we learned that we're just one among many. But very grateful for that process of the steps. I understood very little of it as I did it that first summer, but thank God I did it, because I've built a foundation out of that crazy, weird experience. And I've gone back and done some fourth and fifth stuff with my sponsor as things have come up with relationships and things like that over the years, and have gone back through 6 and 7 with my sponsor over certain issues. But I think you got to start somewhere. Even if you're crazy and you're weird and you're lying about half the stuff and you don't know you're lying, you're at least being willing, right? And so that was my experience, and very grateful to that. And so I was able to go back to college. Appalachia wasn't sure they were going to let me back in. I literally just flipped to close my back. I had to meet with their counseling department and figure out why I had left and what was wrong with me. And I did. And I told them I'd been in treatment and got sober, and they let me back in. I was probably not a very good bet to go back to college. And I ended up living in the very same dorm that I had blamed all my drinking on, or a lot of my problems on. I thought that everybody drank in there was chock full of all kinds of trouble. And it wasn't. I went back the next year. They let me back in, and there were good people living in that place. They weren't all drunk like I thought they were. Just it's a matter of perception sometimes. I had an excellent roommate. I was wondering who my roommate was going to be. We communicated a little bit by phone. as a freshman, which I was, I hadn't finished one semester, you have to live in the dorm for the first year, and you have a roommate in a very small little room. And I didn't know who this guy was, but I wanted to make sure he understood that I wanted to stay sober. I mean, I've always had excess enthusiasm about everything, whether it's drinking or whatever it was, but I was on fire for my sobriety, and I'm grateful for that. But I thought, man, when I find my roommate, he's going to have to hear about my AA membership, because I want him to know I don't want him drinking in the room, and I'm trying to stay sober. And so I literally passed the guy in the hall as he's coming into the room, and I'm unloading some stuff from the car. And when I get back to the room, there he is. And so I immediately proceeded to start telling him my story. And this wasn't an AA meeting, so I went heavier on some of the other aspects of it. So I wanted him to understand where I was coming from, and that I didn't want to drink or get in that kind of trouble again. And he's just looking there like, man, what have I gotten myself into here with this guy, you know? But that's just how it was. You know, I think the big book talks about that sometimes that excess enthusiasm for sobriety is okay. I think I'd rather be a little too crazy about my sobriety than a little too nonchalant about it. I think it has served me very well. That part in the big book talks about the gaunt prospector. I think it's in the family afterward that our pick struck gold, the lifetime of frustration knew no bounds, as we sort of stumble on the steps in our sobriety that we find in AA, sort of what we've been looking for all along in our drinking. And that was certainly true for me. And, you know, I think I probably did go a little bit overboard. I went to meetings almost every night for the first several years of my sobriety. I called my sponsor every day when I got back to college, and all that served me very well. You know, I was a guy that I knew if I drank, I wouldn't last very long in college. I had a really good track record to show that I don't even get to finish one semester. I blew everything up. And so what some of the early folks told me was that if you keep your sobriety first, you'll probably be okay. If you go up there and stay sober, I bet you'll get an education. You know, it seems opposite. You think that I should go up there and treat my school as my job and keep that first and all that. And I think that's important to do that. But I know if I'm drinking, that school, whatever, my other stuff is going to fall by the wayside in favor of drinking. And I'm grateful that I have always known that. And that may be an unearned gift of mine. I have never thought that was ever any different for me. I've worked with people who relapsed before who seem like they change on that they know that for a while, then they don't know it anymore, or they become convinced that they can drink again for different reasons. And I'm grateful that I've always known that if I took a drink, I might not get in trouble that first night, but it won't be very long, that it will be very much objectionable to me and others. And I think my brother's still sitting in the meeting. I'll call him out on this, but he ended up taking his drinking a fair bit further. He got sober, I guess, 4 years ago now, in 2016, I believe. But if there's ever any further indication that we got just a crazy strain of alcoholism in our family, I got to watch my brother, unfortunately, collapse with his alcoholism in a very, very major way. Took it way further in almost any way you can imagine than I did. He was in very bad shape. And he ended up getting sober himself, too. I never thought, in fact, I had written him off. We had tried to make a few attempts with him, and it hadn't worked. And he had his own experience getting sober, and I'm very grateful that he did. But it was very sobering to me to watch her. We're only 3 years apart, and to watch him do that. And certainly, if there were ever any notion in my mind that maybe I was an alcoholic, that certainly quashed it. But I'm grateful for that I've always known that if I didn't come here and continue to stay active, that I would get into trouble one way or the other. And what I've had most of the time in my life, you know, I'm married now, I've got kids and a family and a career, and there are always, you know, the weird problems with that sometimes, but I've been tortured most by some of the demons in my own head, some of the weird stuff I've been afraid of, obsessed with, bad choices I've made in sobriety, but I've always stayed right in the middle of AA. There's only been one time when I was so weird that I wouldn't go to my home group, and it wasn't a matter of willful not wanting to go in. I was in such a strange headspace about 7 or 8 years ago that I had trouble getting out into my car to go. And I'm willing to share that kind of experience with other people as we need to. But if I had not been right in the middle of AA as life visited during those times, sometimes it was self-imposed by my mind. Sometimes it was problems with family and work and whatever else. I don't think I'd have stayed sober. I think I would have lost my mind. And so I've been very grateful for the men and women who have continued to lead me in Alcoholics Anonymous. I've had the same sponsor. I don't know how I lucked out with that. You know, I had no idea what a good sponsor would look like when I got sober. I thought he had to be young, smoke cigarettes, listen to rock and roll, you know, all kinds of this list of, you know, someone who looked like me and sounded like me. And I ended up picking a guy who's my parents' age. He is my parent. He's 70 years old now. He's old now, you know. But Steve's a good guy. I've had the same sponsor for 23 years. And something to be grateful for. We don't always get that kind of stuff. And very grateful for what he has passed on to me. In fact, a lot of stuff I share is just stuff I've probably stolen or have absorbed into my own story and shared it out with you guys. But I'm very grateful for that leadership. And so it has allowed me to live life, and I've continued to stay active in Alcoholics Anonymous, continue to look for newcomers. And I think the longer I'm sober, the more I appreciate working with newcomers now. I mean, that's really what I think people get on fire for that at different points in their sobriety. Some people do it right off the bat. And I've always liked working with new people, and I've always tried, but I think I've gotten a deeper appreciation for it. I know Steve Moore talks about that in his talk some. And Richard Page, who was a member of your group before he died a number of years ago, he was a guy who was sober much less than I was, but seemed to, it always frustrated me. I never said anything about it. He always seemed to be wiser and had a deeper appreciation for sobriety and newcomers than I did. And it would frustrate me sometimes, but I think some people get that earlier. And Richard was a guy who would go out of his way to work with a new guy. He'd give him the shirt off his back, and he'd give him his A book in a heartbeat. And so really good example of that. And I think that if anything, I've stayed on the path. And thank God I've gotten better. I have to look back. It's hard to see day to day sometimes, but thank God I'm not the same guy I was even 10 years ago or 23 years ago. And that is absolutely the result of Alcoholics Anonymous and staying here and staying sober. That is the way it is. And so I think I'm winding out on time here. It's cool to be here with you guys. I've appreciated Zoom talks. They're not the easiest thing to do. My family and cats, for the most part, have not interrupted here. So I'm going to go ahead and shut it down and count my blessings that no one has interrupted here yet. But it's good to see those of you that I can see here through Zoom, and appreciate you guys listening to me tonight. Thanks.
Thanks, Robert. Now we are going to read or pass the basket.